No,
Oh.
I got it.
Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. Joining me, as usual, is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western and also is a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. And also one of our regulars is Felix Brooks. Felix teaches at Western in the criminal justice program, teaching courses on juvenile delinquency, and has a fairly new position as the director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. And we'd like to welcome as our guest this time around, Harold Beu, and Harold is a retired Unitarian Universalist minister
and a teacher.
and was also a high school teacher, and welcome, member
Thank
of
you, Ron.
KNOW as well. So.
Right.
Welcome, Harold. I think this is the first time we've had you on Critical Issues.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, well, welcome.
Yeah.
So the critical issue that we want to focus on this time around is Iran, U.S.-Iranian relations. As many people might know, in early April, the United States, along with what it's called the P5+1, it's basically the UN Security Council members that hold the veto, the U.S., Russia, France, Germany, and Great Britain, plus Germany, the P5+1, concluded their negotiations with Iran and created a framework agreement. Now, they still need to finalize the agreement, and they hope to do that by the end of June, and we'll get into what this agreement actually says. It concerns, of course, the alleged Iranian nuclear weapons program. Mm-hmm. But before we get into the P5+1 agreement, I think it's important to sketch out the historical context here. Mm-hmm. We need to focus a little bit on the history of U.S.-Iranian relations. So, Felix, you want to start by taking us back to 1953?
Yeah,
I think we could start early, but I think 53 is probably the best starting point
yeah,
there.
just a few years before I was born, but I don't think you can look at this issue, and we were talking about this before the show, without going back to that context.
Right.
Because there seems to be this notion that the countries in the region are undemocratic. And what we find is that if we look at Iran, they had a democratically elected government in 1953 that the American CIA and British MI6 worked tirelessly to overthrow because the leader at that time decided to nationalize what we now know as BP, the national oil company there. And when he did that, that triggered a series of events where the Americans and the British cooperated in overthrowing the government. Mm-hmm. And so the democratically elected government was then ousted, and the Shah of Iran came into power. Again, I think for the second time, because he had been in power once before, and had left power when he was defeated by the leader of the Democratic opposition, and then came back into power after the coup in '53.
So the prime minister that was overthrown was Mossadegh,
Yeah.
who had been democratically elected, and the coup. And again, I think we should point out that the U.S. State Department and CIA had an important role to play in this overthrow. The Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State at the time, and his brother Alan, who was the head of the CIA. And so we overthrew the democratically elected government, restored the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to the throne. Was it the Peacock throne, I think?
Yes.
The Peacock throne.
And basically what you had was a U.S. installed tyrant. And the secret police were very strong, and so it was a very brutal dictatorship that the Iranian people experienced.
The Savak, right?
Yeah, the
Savak, yeah. So the next important date, I guess, in this brief history would be 1979. What happened in 1979?
Well, I
Harold,
want to
do you
get
wanna
back
take it?
to talking about this
Go ahead.
53.
Yeah.
Actually, we should begin with World War I, when the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was created. And it's important for people to know that for that company that they extracted oil from Iran, and for every dollar that the Iranians got, the company got $9. And so
An equitable arrangement?
yeah, right. and that's what Mossadegh was trying to change. Mm-hmm. And they did talk about a 50-50 split, but eventually he came to the idea of nationalizing the oil company, and he pointed to the Brits that they nationalized their coal company. But the British said, well, that's okay for us to do, but not for you to do, and that
Yeah.
we are in charge here. So
It's called American exceptionalism.
yeah, well, this is
East
British
Western
versus British. And I can
exceptionalism.
tell you, I've known some Iranians. I was talking to Don about this, and the Iranians like American people, and they really look to America as a beacon of hope before 1953. But they don't like the Brits. And I think it's partly because the British exploited them for so long, and besides they had that imperial kind of attitude.
Colonial history there.
Yeah, when they had that
Yeah.
attitude.
Yeah.
Yet they were better than the Iranians and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Western imperialism certainly plays a very large role.
Very much so, yeah.
In the setup to this
Right.
and continuing.
And the Shah,
the story.
I mean, he was the Shah. It was just that, like in other countries, that the prime minister had power more than the Shah. The Shah was more or less a figurehead, but he became marginalized, and then the United States sent in this henchman, Kermit Roosevelt, who's the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, to spend a lot of money and threaten people with murder, and actually got such chaos going. Even though the Shah was very much liked by the Iranian people, they created such chaos that people got scared, and they, since they bribed the police and the military, they were able to overthrow him. And I think that's really amazing. And if that happened in our country, I mean, we wouldn't forget that.
Right.
And so they haven't forgotten it. And I would like to read, Ron, this historian, what he says about that.
Stephen Kinzer.
Well, this one, yeah, it's from Stephen Kinzer's book called Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. It's an interesting book. But this is a historian named James Bill, who said, well, this is Kinzer. He says, the main results of the '53 coup were the end of democracy in Iran and the emergency in its place of a royal dictatorship that a quarter of a century later set off a bitterly anti-American revolution. That was 1979. And then, quote, this is from James Bill. Operation Ajax, that's what it was called, Operation Ajax, that the Brits,
53 overthrow.
Yeah, 53 overthrow, with the British and the CIA and Kermit Roosevelt, right, thank you. Anyway, Operation Ajax locked the United States into a special relationship with the Shah and signaled the powerful entrance of American intelligence and military activity into Iran. The U.S. intervention alienated important generations of Iranians from America and was the first fundamental step in the eventual rupture of the Iranian-American relations in the revolution of 78 and 79. And then getting to the 78, 79, well, they talk about here that the Shah did not tolerate dissent, repressed opposition, like you mentioned, Ron. And it said after the 58 coup, diplomats and intelligence agents at the American Embassy in Tehran fell in the habit of relying for information most exclusively from the royal court. As a result, they were blind to the growing threat in Iran. And then that's what gave rise to a broad coalition of anti-Shah people. I knew some Iranians, this was back in '71, when I was at Ohio State, our alma mater, that you know, they hated the Shah. This is 1971. They just despised him. And I think it was general around there. And it's interesting, if I knew that, why didn't our government know that? Why didn't Carter know that? So we were blinded to that reality. And you know, people don't understand. I mean, as much as I don't approve of a theocracy, I don't approve of the Ayatollah Khomeini and some of his antics, but there was reasons for why they came to power, that we were responsible for creating the conditions to make the Ayatollah come to power.
So in '79, the revolution takes place. Ayatollah Khomeini takes power, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is created.
Right.
So again, now we have the theocracy that you talked about. And then also in 1979, Don, what happened that led to a particularly important event that concerned the United States?
Well, as the revolution succeeded, they invaded the American embassy and they took hostages. Which,
It was after Carter allowed the Shah to come to the U.S.
That's right.
for
Medical
cancer
treatment.
that's right.
So
Exactly.
that was the background, but that was the
Precipitating, yeah.
precipitating
Yeah, that
incident.
was the
So-
precipitating event, yeah, and I guess Carter's idea was, well, we have to be loyal to our people, to the people that we supported, and they said, that's exactly why we're coming after you guys. And that lasted up until Ronald Reagan took office in
1980.
the day that he was sworn in. Carter went to free the hostages there, and it was a big factor in Carter's defeat in the 1980 presidential
Yeah.
election. So it had
Yeah,
huge
it was a
repercussions.
aborted attempt to military,
Right,
you know,
they
free 'em, yeah.
attempted and it failed, and it was a disaster, and made him look incompetent there. And on the news programs at night, they would report this is the 127th day of the captivity of
Right.
the Americans.
This is where Ted Koppel's Nightline came
Yeah,
from.
that's where it
started.
Because it started out as a special
Right.
report on the
Right.
American hostage situation. And so it was day 5, day 6,
Right.
and it went on and on. Eventually, they just changed the name to Nightline with Ted Koppel. But that's how that program originated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the 52 hostages were held for 444 days, as you
444.
mentioned, until January of 1981. And then they were released.
And that split has never been healed. That was the ultimate split between our nations, and it stayed that way. But you mentioned that under Clinton there was some warming.
There was, yeah. They did, and, you know, Madeleine Albright apologized for the '53 coup, and she was Secretary of State at the time.
So that began to develop
Yeah,
some kind of
they
a thing.
started to thaw a little bit, yeah.
There's another important event, though, prior to Clinton coming into
Yeah.
office, I think that needs to be mentioned here, and that is the Iraq-Iran War,
Right.
which
Right.
started in September of 1980.
And that-
So Iraq invaded Iran,
Right.
and at this point, Saddam Hussein was our guy,
Right.
and we actually supported the Iraqi invasion of Iran,
Absolutely.
secretly channeled aid. There's the famous photograph of Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah.
Working within the Reagan administration, going to
Yeah.
Iraq
And they're
and shaking
smiling and-
hands
yeah.
with Saddam
Saddam,
Hussein.
Did
yeah.
you know Saddam actually spoke at the Detroit Economic Club?
Did he
at
really?
that time, around that time?
Wow.
Yeah, he was our guy for
He was
quite
our
a
guy,
while,
yeah.
and so we did tilt toward Iraq during that conflict, and it's
Yeah.
actually during that conflict that Saddam Hussein did, in fact, use chemical weapons
Right.
against some of his own people. I
Which
think
were made in the United
which were
States?
made in the United States, but he did so with no complaint from the U.S. government at that
Right.
particular
Yeah.
point.
Right, right.
Because the Iranians were our enemy, so
Right,
we didn't really
right,
care
right.
much, you know.
Yeah, yeah. So I think so adding on to this history of
Yeah.
bad relations between the United States and Iran, I think we have to mention the tilt of the U.S. toward Iraq during that war.
I think one thing that should be said is that with realpolitik, you know, the Kissinger kind of motto, that they looked at Saddam as a secular leader, and they were concerned about the fervent religious movements in the Middle East, and so that's why we made him our guy.
Because he was secular.
He was
Yeah, he was more
secular. I
palatable.
mean, he was a brutal dictator. He murdered people, and he invaded countries and all that kind of stuff. But I think that's why we supported him at that time.
That war was a particularly brutal
Yeah,
war.
it was.
It was very
and
Oh, they lost. Yeah,
a lot of young kids they put out on the
Kids,
front
yeah.
lines just to be shell troops and shock troops and
Right.
be destroyed. So the bitterness from that war endured for.
And it's interesting because before Saddam invaded Kuwait back in '91, he talked to April Gillespie, what's her name?
Glaspie.
Glaspie, who was the ambassador at the time, and she said basically, U.S. wipes our hands about your matters, essentially give him the green light. And I think that's what he thought, and he thought the United States would, just like when he invaded Iran, it was a similar situation.
Yeah.
So I don't think he counted on the United States to actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to Iran, though,
Yeah.
I also want to point out that despite this sort of history of bad relationships, there was a time when we actually cooperated with Iran and this is the famous Iran-Contra scandal.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Contra
Exactly.
So now, this is interesting, isn't it? Because at that point, of course, now we're back to the Central American issue
Right.
with Nicaragua. The Sandinistas
Right.
have become the democratically elected government in Nicaragua.
Right.
The Contras are the former ruling class that wants to get back into power. They're plainly a terrorist group, but they're
Yes.
supported by the United States, by the Reagan administration. But then eventually Congress was banning any aid to be given to the Contras in Nicaragua. So what happened was that, and the Israelis were a part of this, interestingly enough, we sold missiles to Iran, sort of under the table. Through the Israelis, we sold missiles to Iran, and then the profits, the money from that was then secretly channeled to the Contras down
Oh,
in
yeah.
Nicaragua.
I was there.
The Iran-Contra scandal, as it was called at the time.
Yeah, it was in a Swiss numbered account.
Yeah.
Reagan could have been impeached on
Right.
this basis, except
Right,
that they
right.
were able to give plausible deniability to his actual involvement. But if you remember, back in '86, there were huge congressional hearings
Yeah.
on the scandal. And Don, you were down
Well,
in Nicaragua
I was
a lot
living
this
there at
time.
that time, yeah. And I think a couple things. It was illegal to sell weapons to Iran, wasn't
Yes.
it? It
Yeah.
was illegal
Well,
to do that.
they were on the terrorist list,
Yeah.
I think,
Right.
at that point. So,
Yeah. So they were actually stealing from the United States and selling those weapons to Iran, and then supplying to the Contras. And the other thing that is on there is Gary, I can't remember his last name, who wrote a book called Dark Victory.
Gary Webb.
Gary
Oh,
Webb,
yeah.
Gary
who
Webb.
said that not only were that, but they were using that when those planes would return empty, they were filling them with drugs and bringing them to the United States.
Right. Oh,
And
yeah.
Gary Webb's contention is that started the crack epidemic. Now,
Right.
there's a lot of evidence that he's right, but
Right.
they drove that guy to the point where he ended up committing suicide.
Right.
So there was all this terrible stuff going on, and all under the table, not being known. And, we were supporting Iran, but just for the money. It was just
Right.
for the
Yeah.
money that they could get.
Right.
That's the only
Also-
way they could get the money to the
It
Contras.
should also be pointed out that supporting the Contras was against the Boland Amendment.
Absolutely,
So
yes.
that violated the law as well.
Well, one of the things about that is, and Ron, you worked with us on that too. We worked so hard to get that Boland Amendment passed.
Right.
And which forbade any kind of aid to the Contras.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
then to find out afterwards that all the work that we had done was just didn't make a
It was being
difference at
undermined
all.
by
They
the
just
CIA. And that was,
violated the whole
and this comes
thing.
after the church hearings in the 70s where they weren't
Exactly.
supposed to engage in that sort
Right,
of behavior.
absolutely.
And they were doing it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a renegade government at that time.
Yeah.
One other event that I think needs to be mentioned as part of this broader history, then, the Iraq-Iran war drug on
Yes.
for quite some time,
Right.
well into the late 1980s. And at one point, we sent some U.S. naval forces into the Persian
I
Gulf.
didn't remember that.
And in July of 1988, an Iranian Air Flight 655
Right.
was shot down
Yeah.
by the USS Vicence.
Yeah.
It was a
Commercial
civilian
airline.
airliner,
Yeah.
commercial civilian
Oh,
airliner
right.
in its proper airspace. And to this day, where I'm not really sure exactly why the Vincennes shot down that plane, but 290 people were killed.
Right.
So again, if we want to add that to the list, why would Iran not like or trust
All the,
the
dis- the
United
distrust.
States?
Yeah.
Exactly. Enormous.
Yeah.
And every reason to
Yeah.
distrust.
It's very similar to the KL-007, the Korean, that was shot down by the Soviets. And
Same
can
sort
you
of
remember
backdrop,
how angry we were? And
Yeah.
you know how I think it was Cuomo wouldn't allow the Russian ambassador, the Soviet ambassador, to go to the United Nations, which is illegal. I mean, the United Nations
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
But so you can imagine how it would feel if somebody shot down our airline.
Right, exactly.
And then to add on to this, if we move things forward a little bit more to the George W. Bush administration, after 9/11, of course, and Iran had absolutely nothing to do with
Right.
9/11,
No.
and neither did Iraq, right?
Right. Saudi Arabia.
But if you remember, in the State of the Union address in 2002, George W. Bush made reference to the axis of evil.
Right.
Yeah.
Axis of
Axis
evil.
of evil.
Axis of evil,
And of
yeah.
course, two components of that axis of evil were Iraq and Iran, who of course were bitter enemies and
and
had just
North
fought a
Korea.
war.
Yeah.
North
Yeah.
Korea.
Yeah.
North Korea was the third one, but he lumped them together. So
Yeah.
here, again, how are the Iranians supposed to feel? Because they expressed tremendous support for the United
Right.
States after 9/11.
Right, they did.
They did offer their condolences.
They were
and,
like the only Middle East
Muslim
Muslim country that did, really.
Yeah.
Because even Turkey
Yeah.
was pretty silent on that during
And
that
that,
time.
again, I think that comes from my experience. I mean, I knew an Iranian professor that they like Americans. They don't like American government, but
Yeah.
the Iranians like
Yeah.
Americans. And I think they really are sympathetic to us at that time. I mean, it was clear. So that's true.
Now again, we also need to point out, going back to the history of imperialism, first the British Empire and then U.S. involvement,
Right.
that Iran is rich in energy resources,
Yes.
right?
Right.
We know that it has oil and natural gas resources, really extensive resources there. It's in a very strategic geopolitical location. If you look at the map,
Right.
Iran is between Iraq and Afghanistan,
Right.
and of course at the crossroads there between the Middle East and South Asia. So it's in a very strategic location. So again, we understand why Western imperial interests are very concerned with both the economic and geopolitical interest in Iran. So that's, I think, all part of the background now to then what has emerged as the issue in more recent years is the allegation that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. Right? So this gets us to the core issue right now. And so we almost had a point during the George W. Bush administration where they were ready to attack Iran. I don't know how many people remember, but back in 2007, the Bush and Cheney were really itching to, and the neocons who populated that administration. If you remember, one of their lines was, real men want to go to Tehran, right? Okay, we've taken out Baghdad.
Right.
We've taken out Baghdad with the Iraq war, but real men want to go to Tehran.
Right.
So they also had Iran on their list of targets, and of course the main charge was that they were developing a nuclear weapon. Now it's clear that Iran, and Harold, you can add into this a little bit later, but they were certainly engaged in the enrichment of uranium. They had centrifuges to enrich uranium, which could eventually lead them to obtain a critical mass, which could be used to build a nuclear weapon. But the only thing I think that stopped the attack before Bush and Cheney left office was the fact that the CIA, well, actually it was a National Intelligence Estimate, which is the 16 major. Why do we have to have 16 intelligence agencies in this country?
I heard it was
16.
22, but
Well, I think it's increased since.
Yeah.
But at this point, we had 16.
Right.
But when they come together and issue a national intelligence
Right.
estimate, it's the combined assessment of
right.
these 16 different agencies, the CIA and the lead.
Right.
The 2007 National Intelligence Estimate basically said, look, Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon at this point. They have some infrastructure that's developing, but there's no evidence whatsoever that they are pursuing a nuclear weapons program at this particular point. Now, George Bush talks about this later on in his memoirs, that undercut him, that he disagreed with that assessment, and but he what could he do? How could he go and attack Iran now when the intelligence agencies have basically said they don't have a weapon, and that was going to be the sole basis for going after them. And of course, the Israelis keep alleging that Iran is developing this weapon as well. So that 2007 NIE has been reaffirmed every year since then. Now, despite the fact that the Iranians have advanced their enrichment of uranium and they have developed some other critical infrastructure, and they could turn and pursue this path. But the National Intelligence Estimate says at this point that they are not actively pursuing the nuclear weapon. But why would they even make any effort to get the centrifuges, enrich the uranium, produce bomb-proof shelters for some of the critical infrastructure? We were talking a little bit about this off the air, but what's the general sense of why would Iran even make a feint toward this line when they know that there's Israel sitting with nuclear weapons, there's the U.S. that's been breathing down their neck all this time?
Felix had the right idea.
Felix, do you want to take a crack on that one?
I don't know if I had the right idea, but I think a lot of it has to do with the politics, the regional politics. Take the United States Soviet Union out of the equation and look at the region. and who's been vying for supremacy in that area, between Iraq and Iran and the Saudis and Israel. So there's some regional politics, I think, that are at play there too, that dictate some of the decisions that get made. They don't always look at it through the prism of the United States or through the Soviet Union. But what are Iran's interests?
Yeah.
What would their interests be in developing a bomb? And it might be, like as Harold would say, as a counter to Israel, to Pakistan, to India, who also have bombs.
Sure.
That we know
I mean,
we know they have these things.
Right, there's every reason for that. But even just to give the impression, to give the threat that other people, like you said before, that, Saddam, when they dismantled their weapons of mass destruction program, he wanted that not public because
Right.
he wanted them to feel that
to
he
believe.
still had
Yeah.
those
Right.
things.
Yeah.
Right,
That
yeah.
was his-
So
That was his
that could
downfall.
be part of it.
Well, I think, it's hard to determine what people are thinking and feeling. It's hard enough to know what I'm thinking and feeling. But it's interesting that George W. Bush talked about the axis of evils, and he named those three countries, Iraq and Iran, and then North Korea. North Korea has done things that are clearly threatening, and they have
Yeah.
tried to develop. They have developed a bomb.
They have developed.
They have
They
developed,
have
and
developed.
they're
They know they
developing
got it.
missiles, and they actually are trying to attempt to get missiles that could reach the United States even. You notice we didn't invade North Korea. And any country with a nuclear weapon and the capacity to use them, with missiles, they don't get invaded. So I think there is a rationale from the Iran's point of view, especially when the United States and Israel is talking about attacking them, that if they had a bomb, that'd probably dissuade Israel and the United States from attacking them because we have that mutual assured destruction. So that, I think from their point of view, that makes sense. And
logical.
why shouldn't they have it and Israel have the bomb? Why should, in Pakistan, like you mentioned, Pakistan and India, and all these other countries, France and Britain and China and the United States. From their point of view, I think it makes sense that, why would Israel have the bomb? They feel like it protects them. It's unfortunate. It's a really dangerous thing, and we need to eliminate these weapons. But I think that's one of the things people think about. These leaders.
Except they know that if they came
Yeah,
close to using it, they
Well,
would
if they-
immediately be destroyed.
Right.
Because we got such surveillance over
But
it.
if they had the weapon already, and they had it in place, and they had, and that's the other thing in this, and we should get to this about the agreement that has been made by the P5+1.
Yeah.
And that's important to know. It's not just Obama; it's these other countries.
That's right.
But it seems clear, according to Muniz, I think that's how you pronounce the Secretary of Energy, who's a physicist, that they know if they're going to cheat. They have all kinds of ways, and they're going to have inspectors.
Yep.
They have satellites. They have scientific ways.
On site.
And as
On
soon
site
as they
inspection.
cheat, they'll know, and then they
'Cause
can
you
go
can't
back.
you can't hide that kind of footprint.
No.
Right. Well, now
No.
you can't now. Not because of the technology's improved so much on detection. But the thing that seems so obvious to me that I mentioned to you guys before is, why do you have to hurry to attack Iran? Why not try diplomacy? See what happens. Give it a year or two. We had containment of the Soviet Union for 50 years, and they had missiles.
Yeah.
They had thousands of missiles. So why don't I don't understand the rush.
Well, so again, the reason that the Iranians might be making even a feint toward developing the weapon would be for purely defensive purposes.
Yeah, right,
I can't
sure.
see, and the charges, of course, from the war hawks in the U.S. and the Israelis is that they're developing this for offensive purposes. It's like that if Iran developed a nuclear weapon, the next day they would drop it on
Yeah.
Israel.
Yeah.
And that's just suicidal. Obviously,
Suicide.
Iran
Yeah,
would be
absolutely.
obliterated.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
no. So there's no.
It's not rational.
These men are not irrational. They're not
Right.
stupid.
No.
They're not developing a weapon for offensive purposes.
Right.
And all the other charges about how Iran is such a meddlesome country in the region, and that
Right.
Iran has not invaded another country since 1785.
Right.
George Washington might have been upset about it, but I don't think the current administration, they have not invaded another country since 1785. And yet they look to their west and they see
Right.
what? That,
Absolutely.
that Iraq was
Well-
invaded. They look to their east and they see Afghanistan was invaded on either side of them. And of course, they also look at the U.S. partnership with Israel,
And Saudi
Right.
Arabia, for
continues
that
to
matter.
threaten them. The U.S. partnership with Saudi Arabia, which is also, now this brings us to the Sunni
Right.
Shia divide,
Right.
right? Because Iran is Shia and Saudi Arabia is Sunni dominated. So again, does Iran have offensive intent? Well, Iran certainly wants to be a regional power, and they want to try to survive in a very hostile environment.
Right.
So one could understand why they might make a move toward, threatening that they're going to develop this weapon for defensive purposes.
Well, and it also suggests why they would make a move to actually negotiate now to
Well-
get rid of the sanctions, because that would help them with their economy, and that would help them to be a bigger power. And obviously, as we've seen on TV, that the ordinary Iranians welcome this. They want this.
Right.
They want to have good relations
They were,
with the rest of the
they were
world.
celebrating in the
Right.
street at the
Right.
at the announcement of the
So,
framework.
But I think, to be fair, it's not like Iran has been a good actor as of late. I mean, but that's,
Unlike us.
Yeah, right. I mean, I want to read to you. I wrote a paper on this, and I want to read to you The Economist, the British magazine Economist, which is not
very conservative.
a conservative paper. And this is the editorial from The Economist of April 4th. It says, the Islamic Republic insists that it wants peace, but has built secret bomb-proof facilities for enriching uranium. And most outsiders conclude begun works on design for nuclear weapons. What that means is they made it possible that they could quicken the possibility of getting a bomb sometime in the future, like a month or two. And that's what the negotiations are trying to do. They're lengthening that to 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
So at the same time, it spouted anti-Semitism and sponsored militias in Lebanon and the Gaza Strip. And we can say we have done the same. And Israel's done the same. It's fighting directly or by proxy in Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen, like we don't, and often supporting vicious sectarian clients. And this is from The Economist, a conservative magazine. Despite Iran's transgressions, this week's progress towards an agreement to limit its nuclear program is still welcome. So even this conservative magazine supports negotiations.
And let's put those alleged transgressions in some
Yeah.
kind of a larger context, okay?
Right.
So Iran, certainly there are Shia-supported militias that are fighting in Iraq.
Right.
But who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the
ISIS.
Islamic State, right? ISIS.
And so we're allies with.
And we're allies with
Right,
them
yeah.
because we're providing the air cover
Right.
for those militias to
Right.
Right.
fight and drive the ISIS out
Right.
of Tikrit and other spots.
But
We
the funny
depend-
thing about it is we choose not to acknowledge that that's
Right.
That's
happening.
right.
No
They
cooperation.
No.
It's a
no.
coincidence, but no
We
cooperation.
depend
we
on
just
Iran.
happen to be bombing them at the
Right.
same time they're
Yeah.
fighting them.
Well,
right?
we depend on them because they're using soldiers, which we won't
Right.
use.
Ground forces.
So they're using ground
Exactly.
forces.
So is that a transgression for which Iran should be held? I thought ISIS was the
Right.
enemy, right? And again, they're aligned with Syria and Assad.
Right.
But who's also fighting ISIS in Syria? It's Assad.
It's a
And we
mess.
want Assad to. We don't like Assad. We want him
Yeah.
to go, but we also want him to defeat ISIS, right?
Yeah.
And so, and again, their support for Hezbollah and Hamas.
Well, I just want to make the point that they're no angels, but we aren't either. I mean, nobody is.
It's
Nobody
complex.
has. Nobody
Yeah,
has
it's
clean
complex.
hands.
Yeah.
This is their neighborhood, also,
Right.
right? This is.
Well,
I
in the
mean,
United States too. I mean, we're not in that neighborhood, but we created atrocious atrocities. Like we mentioned in '53,
Sure.
and many others, like you mentioned with the Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
So there's nobody with clean hands here, and
No.
that really bugs me that people act with self-righteous anger that like we're right and they're wrong. I mean, it's absurd.
I mean, yeah. Go ahead, Don.
Well,
Yeah.
the one thing I was going to say is, in Monday's New York Times, the foreign minister of Iran wrote a column in which he said, the whole region is a mess. Let's go to the United Nations and try to sort this out.
Right.
And I haven't heard any response to that. But it seems to me that was the most logical thing that could be done right now. I mean, because it is a mess and it's getting worse, and the destruction and the number of refugees that are out there. But here's the foreign minister of Iran not saying, nothing's happened, we're okay. He said, let's try to settle this with international mediation. I would have thought we would have jumped on that if we had any kind of serious interest.
In peace.
In peace.
Yeah.
In peace. Because we don't want to put any troops on the ground.
No.
That's a no-go zone. So what you've got right now is a stalemate.
Right.
That could go for the next 15 or 20
Exactly.
years.
And the destruction for the people there.
And that's the power vacuum that ISIS has moved into.
Yeah.
Because they recognize
exactly.
that.
You know,
Exactly.
there's this attitude problem, I think, for the people who oppose diplomacy, and that is that it's like they're proposing continuous war, continuous conflict,
exactly.
continuous hostility, and that's a pessimistic place to be. Having diplomacy suggests that things can improve, and I can see Iran improving, becoming a more a good actor, you know, better relations, not just with us, but with the rest of the world. I mean, my God, our country has transformed. I mean, look at how we started and how we transformed concerning slavery and women's rights and all kinds of issues, and we become better. Germany's become better. Japan's become better. But people don't become better when you treat them with hostility and you keep on threatening them. They don't become better. They become defensive and they become angry and they become more likely to build weapons to protect themselves.
I would like to point out that the United States companies that make military hardware are having a bonanza.
Right.
Because all the Middle Eastern countries now want the latest technology, and they're buying all this stuff from us. So they're sitting back and doing fine. And they're not at all caring what happens when they sell this stuff. But
Right.
they have a very
They have a vested
strong
interest. Yeah.
vested interest in this whole thing continue.
Well, that goes back to the whole military-industrial complex we were talking about with Eisenhower.
Right,
That
right.
in and of itself
Exactly,
is
yeah.
its own
Exactly.
entity.
Yeah.
Right.
And the war hawks in the Republican Party in particular, but there's some in the Democratic Party as well.
Yeah.
To them, the only thing that is allowable is complete submission to U.S.
Right.
will.
That's
There has to be
exactly right.
complete capitulation.
Yeah.
If there's not complete capitulation to our will and our demands, then war is the response. There's no sense of diplomacy in that. In
No.
diplomacy, there are compromises, and that Iran has legitimate interest in the region.
Right.
Is they have to completely capitulate, or we're going to go to war.
And that's just a bad misreading of history, because that's what happened with Germany after World War I.
Yeah.
Which led us
Yes.
directly into World War II some
That's
years later,
true,
because of the
yeah.
same thing, because we expected a complete capitulation. We basically destroyed the country, and we laid the seeds for the World War II right after that,
Exactly.
because of our postures and policies.
Exactly.
And
Yeah,
even
very
more
exactly.
recent history, the wars that we have initiated in the Middle East have worked out so well, haven't they? I mean,
Look
the
at how
invasion of
great.
Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and all of our other
You know,
military,
Ron,
they've
since
all
we're-
succeeded so greatly,
Oh,
haven't they?
yeah.
Since World War II, I don't know many wars that have worked for us.
Yeah, not
Exactly,
really.
exactly.
I mean, what
and
has
yet
worked?
our
Vietnam War?
policymakers just don't seem to learn the
Right.
lesson, right? I mean, we invade Iraq and we make a muddle of the Middle
Right.
East and we give rise to the ISIS and the Sunni extremists, and we just don't seem to learn. If the purpose of our military engagement in the Middle East is to defeat terrorism, right? George W. Bush's global war on terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a miserable
Right.
failure because those military interventions have only strengthened
Exactly.
Sunni
ISIS.
extremists. They have
Right.
only created more terrorists
That's true.
and more threats to the United States. So their policy has been a complete and utter failure. And yet their only insistence is that to do more of it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Without any regard for the consequences of war. The massive human and environmental consequences of engaging in
Yeah.
a war against Iran are just astounding.
Yeah.
So maybe they're not laying out their real motives. Maybe their motives are just to keep power and keep the money flowing to their friends. And that's what's horrible. But they tell that story to the American people,
Yeah.
and the American people don't go into depth on that, and they just go. And this is an endless war, and there's no good end to it. It's just going to get worse. So it just seems like somebody's got to step up and say, whoa. But since they control the government, and since they control Congress, and since they control the media, these issues are not even debated.
I mean, if you ask the average American, and we were talking about this before, if they knew anything at all about what
Right.
happened in Iran in 1953,
Yeah.
they
No.
wouldn't have a clue that we
Yeah.
overthrew their government. They would not know that.
How many of them even know that the foreign minister of Iran asked to negotiate a settlement to all this stuff?
Yeah.
And I think we should particularly condemn the Republicans in the Congress for some of the stunts that they've pulled
Right.
recently.
You mean
the
I mean,
senators?
inviting
Yeah.
Netanyahu
Oh.
to come and address
Oh.
the U.S. Congress. That was clearly a move designed to blow up these negotiations. They wanted Netanyahu there
Absolutely.
to scare
Yeah,
up
we
the
should
war
talk
talk
about him.
and completely
Yeah.
completely blow up these talks.
Right.
On
Right.
top of that, 47 Republican senators sent
Right.
a letter to Iran
Oh.
going over the president. I mean, some would call this treason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some would call this treason, what
Some
they did.
have, yeah.
To write a letter to Iran saying, don't negotiate with our democratically elected president because
Right.
if he's not in office anymore, we might rescind whatever agreements he
Horrible.
comes
Right,
up with.
Really
I mean,
horrible.
that just flies in the face of U.S. political and diplomatic history.
Exactly.
But it's also just an unprecedented move by Republicans in the Congress. So I think both of those moves in particular need to be condemned.
We should talk
Yes.
about Netanyahu. For one thing, he's been crying wolf or whatever.
Yeah.
He's been talking about this since '92. He's been saying any day now Iran's going to get the nuclear weapon since 1992. That's a long time ago. One of the things that I've learned is that he was very close to the Shah, and there was a lot of animus because of his closeness to the Shah between the Ayatollah and Netanyahu. It's like a personal grudge match, actually. And there are many people in Israel who really disapprove of what Netanyahu did when he came here and embarrassed
Most
the
definitely.
president.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there's I think like 100 defense IDF people, Israeli Defense Force people, who opposed Netanyahu in this respect and support diplomacy.
Netanyahu almost lost that election.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost.
he did,
And
he did.
he won it on the basis of appealing to racism and appealing to security needs. And it's understandable. I mean, I understand why, Jews look to Israel because all 2,000 years of European prejudice and oppression and even murder, that they want a homeland of their own. And that's why the Zionist movement began, because of what happened in Europe, not what happened in Palestine.
Right.
And so I understand why they want that. I understand they're in this neighborhood, as you mentioned, Ron, that feels unsafe to them. But again, is this the best way to solve the problem of creating peace, by being more hostile and being more belligerent, more militaristic? And there are a lot of Israelis who are not happy with Netanyahu.
And we do need to point out that the Israelis have nuclear weapons.
They
won't
do.
acknowledge it.
Exactly. And
They won't admit it publicly, but most estimates I read, they have between 200 and 250 nuclear weapons. So I think
Wow.
we need to talk about what the real nuclear threat is here, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Is it the possibility that Iran might, at some point down the line, get one bomb? Or is it the fact that there are people in the region already, Israel, Pakistan, India, and of course, what about the United States? What about the P5? Let's look at the P5, right? The US, Russia, China, Great Britain, and France all have nuclear weapons.
Yep.
All have nuclear weapons. All signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty
Right.
in 1968. The Non-Proliferation Treaty legally binds those countries to move toward disarmament.
Right.
The rest of the world said, okay, we won't develop nuclear weapons. You 5 nuclear powers, you agree that you'll disarm,
Right.
okay, and you have to, engage in good faith negotiations to disarm as quickly as possible. If you do that, we agree we won't seek to achieve nuclear weapons. The rest of the world has held up their end of the bargain. The only violator really is North Korea. They signed it, they rescinded, and then they did develop the weapon. India and Pakistan never signed it.
Yep.
Israel never signed it. Those 3 then eventually, so that the nuclear club's now at 9. But the 5 major powers at the time in '68
Yeah.
signed this agreement, and now they are violating the agreement because they have not engaged in any good
That's
faith
right.
efforts to disarm.
Yeah.
And they're legally obligated under international law to do that, and they refuse to do it. And yet, now they stand in condemnation
Right.
of Iran
Yeah.
because Iran might possibly develop a weapon at
A
some
single.
point down the line. Now, the hypocrisy is just appalling.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Or
leaves
chutzpah, you
it
could
almost
call it.
leaves you
Yeah.
speechless to say we
like
have
that.
thousands of nuclear weapons.
Right.
In fact, the United States has just committed itself. This is under Obama for the last year, $56 billion for
Update.
That's the budget for our nuclear weapons program. The
Right.
update, the modernization is going to be $1 trillion over 30 years.
Wow.
Okay. What was Iran's military budget last year?
Yeah,
Anybody
right.
know?
I don't know.
Minuscule.
$10 billion.
Yeah.
10 billion.
So we are allocating 5 times what the entire Iranian military budget is just
Right.
to our nuclear weapons program. That doesn't even count the additional, $600 billion in the
for
Pentagon
defense
budget, right?
spending, Yeah.
And so
And, you know,
again,
the
it's
other,
just
the other thing is Iran's,
Wow,
unlike
that's
Israel and some Republicans, well, maybe Democrats, they're not threatening people. You know, Israel's threatening to bomb Iran. It has been for a long
Right.
time. And the United States is threatening to bomb Iran. Just like you said, George W. Bush was going to do it. I mean, and there's war talk now. It's really, really scary to me that these people are talking about bombing Iran for no good reason. I mean, Iran obviously is not a threat to us, to the United
No,
States.
not at
And it's
all.
really not a threat to Israel either, for that matter, because as you mentioned, Don, that they'd be wiped out if they.
Absolutely, no
So they wouldn't
chance.
do that. They are rational actors, unlike North Korea. That's a different. And it's really bad to compare those two, because North Korea is a different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
It's different than every other country. But Iran has acted rationally. We can see, and actually they have abided by strictures recently that they actually have seemed to agree to the thing, or they do the things they agreed to recently. So, you know, I don't understand. Why don't you give diplomacy a chance? Unless you love war, unless you want to be hostile with this country, unless you want a continuous war, maybe because, you know, you want to fill the coffers of the military-industrial complex, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know about people's motivations, but what I do know is diplomacy is an act of optimism, and hostility and war is an act of pessimism.
Yeah.
War doesn't lead to good things. Even World War II led to the Cold War and the atom bomb. War just, you know, we're still living the Civil War, for God's sakes. War just leads to bad things. It has environmental damages. It destroys people's relationships. It just creates all kinds of terrible things. And I don't understand why people are so eager to go to war.
especially when Iran keeps making overtures.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
let's go back to April of 2003. At that time, during the Bush administration, there were a husband and wife team, Flint Leverett and Hillary Mann. They worked for the National Security Council. They were Middle East policy experts. They later reported that the Iranians came to them with a very comprehensive package that they wanted to present to the United States. And they wanted to start negotiations. And they were willing to make important concessions on every major issue that was of concern to the United States. So Leverett and Mann thought, well, this is great. Wow, we're really going to be able to gain something powerful out of this negotiation. The Bush administration,
Right.
absolutely not. They absolutely refused to engage in any negotiations. Leverett and Mann, now these are Republicans who worked in the National Security Council under George W. Bush. So these are not wild-eyed radicals like me, right? These are people who worked for
Yeah.
the National Security Council.
Wow.
They left at that point, and they went public with this, and they've written several articles about the fact that they were astounded that here came Iran with a very generous package they wanted to negotiate with the United States, and the George W. Bush administration flatly refused to have anything to do with them at that point.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it called them a part of the axis of evil
Right, right.
Wow.
and threatened to
Wow.
bomb them later on. So that's the astounding thing here too. Is
Yeah.
that it's not only that they're not, that they're not engaged in any kind of negotiations. They seem unwilling to even enter into negotiations where they might have important things to gain from
Right.
a national security standpoint for the United States.
You know, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, it's interesting. It's ideology blinds people so, right? And
Definitely.
you mentioned that George W. Bush did not agree with the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate. He did
Yeah.
not agree with it.
He didn't
What's
agree
a-
with the evidence and
Yeah,
facts.
he did. I mean, how does he know? I mean, it's sort of
No, he
like, someone tells me you need to lose some weight. I say, I don't agree with you. Like, I know I need to lose weight. But the point is, if somebody says something like that, and then he just comes back, I don't agree with it. I mean, it's not like he's an intelligence person, or it's not like he studied the issue, and
No.
he's disagreeing with the intelligence community.
It didn't fit. It didn't fit his narrative.
Exactly. It
And as I said
Well,
before,
and that's the problem we're dealing with.
Yeah.
It's like it's like on the climate change. You see the evidence, and you say, well, it's not true. I mean,
Yeah, right.
now that doesn't make it not true. It just means that you say it's not true, and that may indicate your own,
Well,
lack of
Felix is saying, right.
intelligence. I mean, I
It
don't want
doesn't fit in my mindset. My ideology
and
it doesn't fit in there.
It's
so.
a human thing. I
Yeah,
mean, human
it is.
beings do this,
Well-
but in this case, it's dangerous. This case, it's going to hurt us,
Huge.
and not just the Iranians and the rest of the world, but it's going to hurt us again. And that,
Our policy in the Middle East just seems muddled,
Disaster.
contradictory, and ultimately extremely
so how do you change people's
dangerous.
minds on this? How do you persuade them to see the truth?
The only way you can do it is if people rise up
Yeah.
enforce them, because they have no incentive to do anything different, because it's working for those people that got power now. The only way is if we mobilize people.
So
but
we
that's
got
so
our
hard. It's a long way to go, because
Yeah.
they've done so well in convincing American
Right.
people that the only answer is militarism. This is
Right.
the only thing. This is what saves us.
So we got to get our audience to get behind and write letters and get involved, study the issues,
Yeah.
all that kind of
Especially
stuff.
studying the issues, because again,
Yeah.
like I say, when folks have these narratives, they don't, even if you give them the competing information that says, you know what, point by point, here's what's proven that where you're wrong.
Yeah.
And they still, forget the truth doesn't matter.
Right. Right.
This is what I believe, this is my opinion.
Right. And look at climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, how long have you been working on that? And 98% of the scientists all agree, hey, climate change is real, humans are causing it. If we don't do something, it's catastrophe.
Right.
But we still have trouble getting people to do anything about it. I mean, because there's other people who don't even try to refute the arguments, they just assert. No, we don't have the evidence yet.
Right.
Even some investment committees from universities, I think, do that, don't they?
Yeah.
Well, you can't change what you don't acknowledge.
Exactly.
And we gotta
exactly.
we gotta
Yeah.
begin by acknowledging truth.
Yeah.
And that's our weapon of truth. And hopefully we can get people to do something.
Well, there's a couple of very powerful sort of political and moral frameworks here that are operating that I think make this an extremely difficult thing to address. One, of course, is 9/11, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
9/11
true.
attacks and the fear that they generated, and the way in which the 9/11 attacks were exploited by the war hawks in our
Right.
country continues to exert a very powerful influence. So a lot of Americans feel like that we were attacked completely out of the blue with no justification and there's no background, no history. It just came completely as a surprise, a shock and of course that's not true. There was a lot of background
Sure.
that led up to that particular incident. But the reaction to it now, and we could have responded to it in very different ways, right? We had the sympathy of world. We could have approached it in a diplomatic sort of criminal justice perspective, but no, we decided to ramp up the fear and to take, to do war. And of course, we struck out at Iraq, which had absolutely nothing to do with
And Afghanistan.
and
too.
Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was to use the 9/11, the anger
Yeah.
and the fear,
Right.
to use it to achieve other objectives that,
Right.
that
Sure.
the hawks and the neocons
Right.
had long held. So, but you still have that powerful narrative of 9/11. We were attacked by Muslims, right?
Right.
But people don't make any distinctions there. They
Right,
don't. And
right.
so, who were the hijackers? Who were the ones who carried out the 9/11 attack?
They're all Saudis.
No,
They were
Not
Saudi
all.
Arabian.
Most of them, but
Most
not
of
all.
them.
Yeah.
Most
Some
16 out of
Yemenis.
21.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia is our biggest benefactor
Right.
in the Middle
You know,
East.
the way I look at it, it's like, and it should have been a criminal action. They should have gone after the criminals. That's what they should have
Right,
done. By
right.
making war, they actually played into Osama's hands, because he loves to see himself, or he saw himself as his great opponent to the great
Yeah.
devil.
Well, that's-
But the way I look at it, it's like, there were only 19 people that did that, right? And they were supported maybe by 100 others. Not very many people. And they did this terrible act. And it's sort of like, like there's a drive-by shooting in some neighborhood, like in Watts or something, and it's done by a gang member. And then what happens, the gang members take and bomb the other neighborhood. That's what we did at Afghanistan. We didn't go after perpetrators. We went after Afghans. And the Afghans weren't the ones that were responsible. It was Osama bin Laden. And, the government, too, protecting them. So we had them isolated, actually.
Yeah, we did.
We had the Taliban isolated. And we could have made it a criminal action, and we could have gone after someone as a criminal. But instead, we made it a war. We militarized the problem, and we went after the whole country. We're killing Afghans, and we make them more hostile towards us, make us look like fools, and that war is still going on.
To this day.
To this day. And then, of course, Iraq is similar.
And of course, the actions that we've taken in the Middle East have completely, made the Sunni-Shia divide greater.
Right.
It has led to the battles that we're seeing going on in Yemen,
Right,
and with the development of ISIS, and of course
Al-Shabaab and
the
other
Syrian,
terrorist
groups.
the Syrian. So again, the Sunni-Shia conflicts are going on, and they've only been aggravated by our actions for the most part.
Right.
And yet here we are supporting Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is for the most part the one that's supporting the Sunni extremists, right?
Yeah.
And yet the Sunni extremists are supposed to be the ones that we're fighting against, right? So it's just it's
You know, it's interesting with the
total
ISIS, you know, how and they are terrible, they're awful, they're just really awful group of people. But when they came, we got upset when they beheaded, you know, like American journalists and stuff like that. In Saudi Arabia, you know, like that month, they beheaded 19 people, including a woman that claimed to be a witch. They do that every month, they behead people. And yet we don't talk about that, or we don't, and this alliance with Saudi Arabia goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, who made the alliance because we needed their oil during World War II. And Roosevelt said, well, wash your hands about your dictatorship. It's the only country named after a family, and so the family can control that country, we don't care. But, you know, and they do terrible things, and like you said, most of the hijackers in 9/11 were Saudis.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. So
Yeah.
what's going to happen by June? Are we going to get an agreement?
I think we're going to get an agreement. I really do think we're going to get one. I think the Congress is going to continue to meddle, but I think we're going to end up getting an agreement. Yeah, I think so. I think the Iranians want it just as much as we want it.
I agree with you. I think it'll happen. I think the international pressure will be too much, and Congress will make a feint that they've modified it, but that we'll get an agreement that we're going to, and it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think agreement's going to happen, and it's important to note this is not a treaty. So this is an executive action, and so in a way,
It doesn't have to be ratified
it
by
doesn't
the
have
Senate.
to be ratified, but what they can do is they can pass laws to increase the sanctions, which would be a problem.
Yeah.
But I don't think
they
that's
will.
going to happen, because I think this is not just the United States in Iran.
No, that's right.
This is those 6 countries.
Yeah.
And France in particular was really wanting a stringent agreement, and so apparently they got an agreement that satisfied France. So we're going to go against these countries? I don't think so.
No.
The key sticking point is the sanctions.
Yeah.
The Iranians want the sanctions to be removed
Right.
away.
Yeah.
The agreement, as it stands right now, says that the sanctions will be removed as soon as there's verifiable
Right.
compliance. So that could be that all along has been the major sticking point. I think the sanctions have been counterproductive in the long run, actually, but because it's pushed Iran to take a more hardline stand. So that could be the only thing that would scuttle the agreement, I think, the sanctions.
I
part
think
of it.
that actually, you know, I think you have a critical mass kind of thing. It's exponential. I think, you know, Iran will surprise us. I do believe they're going to do what they agreed to
Yeah,
do.
I do
I
too.
think the more that's discovered, there's more trust, and I think it actually could move rather quickly that the sanctions. And the important sanctions are going to be dropped on banking, and what was the other thing? But those are important to them.
Yeah.
You know,
Banking and
no,
energy.
oil, the oil,
Energy.
So in other words, Barack Obama might actually earn the Nobel Peace
Yeah,
Prize
right.
that he was given all those years
That
ago.
or Cuba?
And when he didn't really deserve it at that point.
He did
Yeah.
not.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank Harold Beu for coming in and
Thank
being
you,
our
Ron.
guest today.
Thank you.
Felix, great to have you with us as usual. Don, it's always good to get together and discuss critical
Yeah.
issues and present alternative viewpoints.
That's
The
right.
kind of viewpoints we present are not heard in the mainstream
true.
media. That's for
Oh,
sure.
amen, brother.
So
Yeah.
I think we play,
Yeah.
hopefully we play an important role here. So thank you for being with us, and we invite you to come back again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.